Millionaire comes home early and can't believe what the nanny is teaching his twins. The Torres estate stood in solemn silence on the northern hill of the city, a majestic structure of white stone and glass proudly overlooking the valley. Yet within those solid walls, there was no sound of children's laughter, no echoes of a happy family. Only silence remained, heavy, suffocating silence that made anyone who entered feel an unsettling chill. At 42, Alexander Torres was one of the most celebrated architects in the country. His name was tied to skyscrapers, modern museums, and lavish mansions designed for the elite. To the outside world, he seemed to have everything: career, wealth, influence. But when night fell and he returned to the vast emptiness of his room, Alexander knew he had nothing left but his blueprints and an unrelenting loneliness. 3 years earlier, his world had crumbled when Elena, the wife he had loved with all his heart, passed away after a relentless illness. In that moment, Alexander lost not only a partner, but also the anchor of his soul. Their twin boys, Daniel and David, were barely 2 at the time. Now, at 5, they were old enough to feel the absence, yet still too young to understand why their father always turned away when they spoke of their mother. Inside the mansion, the name Elena had become forbidden. No photograph hung on the walls. No keepsake was displayed in the living room. Alexander believed that by hiding the past, he was protecting his children from pain. In truth, he was only burying memories, locking his heart away, and leaving his sons to grow up in confusion. The house grew quieter with each passing day. Meals were taken in silence, the clinking of cutlery against plates echoing like hammer blows against emptiness. Daniel, once lively, grew noisier as if to fight the silence, while David, more sensitive, withdrew further into himself. Both longed for their father's affection, but Alexander buried himself in endless work, using his schedule as an excuse to avoid confronting loss. The only one who dared to oppose this silence was Maria Lopez, the housekeeper who had served the family for more than 20 years. She had watched Alexander grow from a mischievous boy into a successful man. She knew better than anyone that beneath his hardened exterior lay a wounded soul. And so, when she saw the boys becoming more unsettled with each day, Maria decided to act. Without waiting for Alexander's permission, she hired a new nanny, Isabella Cruz, a young woman with a degree in child psychology and experience caring for children who had lost loved ones. To Maria, Isabella was not just another employee, but perhaps the last chance to restore warmth to the home. That afternoon, when Alexander returned earlier than expected from a business trip, the atmosphere inside the mansion shifted into something tense and uneasy. His footsteps echoed through the marble hallways, each strike like a warning. The staff quickly bowed and stepped aside. They all knew too well that when the master came home in silence, it never meant anything good. In the study, Maria waited. Her hands were clasped together, her posture steady. The stance of someone who had witnessed every stage of Alexander's life, from mischievous boyhood to a successful yet cold man. She knew this conversation would be difficult, but she also knew it was overdue. "You hired a new nanny without asking me?" Alexander's voice cut through the air, low and cold as ice. Maria neither bowed her head nor trembled. She looked straight into the eyes that once shone with innocence, but now bore cracks of grief. "Yes, sir, I did. The children cannot go on like this any longer. They need stability." Alexander slammed a folder onto the mahogany desk, the sharp sound reverberating through the room. "Stability? In the past 3 years, I've seen 15 people come and go. And you think some young girl will be any different? You've overstepped your place." Maria's tone remained calm, though her heart trembled. "I overstep because I care for them. Daniel is becoming louder and louder just to be noticed, while David retreats deeper into his own world. If this continues, you'll lose both of them, not to illness, but to this silence that is killing their childhood." Alexander clenched his jaw, his hand quivering for a moment before he quickly hid it. "You don't understand. Every decision concerning my children is mine to make. I will not allow anyone, even you, to impose their will." The air seemed to freeze, yet Maria did not retreat. Her voice grew hoarse with emotion. "Alexander, I raised you. I know better than anyone what you need. And now your sons need the same thing. Arms to hold them, warmth to comfort them, and memories of the mother you're trying to bury. You cannot erase Elena from their lives just because her name hurts you." The sound of Elena's name hung in the room like a blade piercing Alexander's heart. He turned away, staring out the window where the fading sunlight painted the garden in shadows. After a long silence, his voice finally emerged, rough and weary. "Fine. She can stay, but only for 2 weeks. If I see anything I don't like, she's gone. No debate." Maria exhaled softly, a trace of relief flickering across her face. She knew she had just gained a small crack in the wall Alexander had built around himself. She nodded, her eyes carrying a quiet spark of hope. The following day, Alexander met Isabella Cruz for the first time. He stepped into the back garden on a mild, sunny morning. A burst of laughter drifted across the lawn, making him pause. Before him was an unfamiliar scene. Daniel and David were running in circles, their cheeks flushed with excitement, while at the center stood a young woman with chestnut hair tied back in a simple scarf. She bent down patiently, showing the boys how to create a little game with leaves and twigs. Isabella looked nothing like the nannies before her, those who wore stiff uniforms and kept a careful distance from the children. She wore a plain cotton dress, old sneakers, yet her eyes radiated a warmth that was rare. When Daniel tripped suddenly, she was quick to catch him, not only soothing, but encouraging him to get up and keep playing. David, usually reserved, laughed aloud at one of her playful stories. Alexander stood at a distance, silently observing. His heart gave a faint ache. How long had it been since he had seen his sons laugh so freely? How long since this garden had echoed with such innocent joy? When Isabella looked up and caught his gaze, she smiled softly and rose to her feet. Without hesitation, she walked toward him. "Good morning, Mr. Torres," she said calmly, polite yet unafraid. Alexander nodded, his expression still cool. "I set the rules in this house. If you want to stay, you must follow them without exception." Isabella did not flinch. "I understand, and I will do everything necessary to keep Daniel and David safe, cared for, and loved. That is my duty." Alexander clasped his hands behind his back as if testing her resolve. "There is one thing above all. In this house, Elena's name is never to be spoken. She is gone. I will not have my children living in the past." For a moment, sorrow flickered in Isabella's eyes, but she quickly nodded. "I understand, sir." Alexander turned away and walked back into the house. Yet the sound of his children's laughter and Isabella's steady gaze lingered in his mind. He had drawn a boundary, but deep inside, something told him this young woman would not be like any who had come before. That evening, Alexander returned late. After a long and grueling day at work, he longed for the silence of the mansion. But as he passed down the hallway, he froze. From David's room came a soft voice, interwoven with the innocent whispers of children. He moved closer, pushing the half-open door. The sight before him struck like a blow. Isabella was kneeling beside the bed, her hands clasped in prayer. At her side, Daniel and David sat with eyes closed, repeating every word. "And we thank our Mother who watches over us from heaven." David's clear little voice pierced Alexander's chest. He stood rigid, every muscle taut. For 3 years, inside this house, no one had dared mention Elena, not once. And prayer had been banished entirely. When Isabella opened her eyes, she met his gaze instantly. Yet instead of fear or shame, she lowered her head slightly. Calm, almost as if she had been waiting for this moment. "Mr. Torres," she said gently, "we didn't expect you home so early." Daniel and David leapt toward him, shouting, "Papa!" But Alexander did not open his arms as he usually did. He remained at the doorway, his voice like ice. "To my study, now." The room stilled. The boys looked at each other, their smiles fading. Isabella placed a reassuring hand on their shoulders. "Finish your prayer and get to bed, little ones. I'll read you a story afterward." Alexander turned and walked away, his heavy footsteps echoing through the corridor. Inside him, anger clashed with the grief he had suppressed for so long. In the study, golden light cast shadows across his grim face. When Isabella entered, Alexander was leaning against the window, gripping a glass of untouched whiskey. "You defied my orders." His voice dropped low, cold as stone. "I made it clear. Elena's name is not to be spoken in this house, and prayer is forbidden." Isabella closed the door behind her and stepped forward. "Religion takes the top spot, and I did not force the children. They asked me to pray." Alexander let out a dry laugh, but his eyes were dark. "They're 5 years old. They understand nothing of death, nothing of religion." "You're wrong," Isabella replied, her tone so steady it startled him. "They understand their mother is gone. What they don't understand is why they are forbidden to speak her name, why there are no photos of her in the house, why every question is met with silence. You call it protection, but to them it is emptiness." Her words cut like a knife into the grief he had buried. He turned his face toward the window, avoiding her gaze. "You have no right to tell me how to raise my children. Your job is only to watch them." Isabella moved closer, her voice softening. "I'm not here to instruct. I'm only reminding you that children need their memories of her. That's not a dangerous past. It's love. Denying it will only leave them with a void you'll never be able to fill." The image of Elena in her final days surged before him, her frail hands clutching his, her eyes pleading as she whispered, "Don't let them forget me." Alexander set his glass of wine down, his cold eyes fixed on her. "You should be packing your bags instead of looking for more trouble." Isabella drew a deep breath. "I understand your anger, but I also know what it means to lose someone you love. I was 16 when my younger brother died of leukemia. For 2 years, I prayed for a miracle that never came." The room fell into silence. Alexander frowned slightly, but didn't interrupt. Isabella went on, her voice lowering. "I watched my parents erase every trace of him, photos, toys, his room. They thought it would ease the pain, but it only made me feel as if he had never existed. I've carried that wound ever since." Alexander braced his hands against the table, his whole body tense. A flicker of turmoil crossed his eyes. His voice came out hoarse. "You know nothing about me. You don't know what it's like to sit at a hospital bed, holding the hand of someone who's praying, begging a silent God, only to watch them take their last breath. That's what I had to endure." His voice broke. For a moment, the icy shell cracked, revealing raw pain. "Elena left this world with her lips still whispering prayers, unanswered. I promised I would protect our children, but how can I let them believe in an empty hope?" Isabella stepped closer, quietly. Her gaze held no pity, only understanding. "I don't blame you for losing faith. I did too. But you cannot take away from Daniel and David the memory of their mother. They don't need a miracle, only to know that her love still lives in every story, every memory." Alexander stared at her as if searching for a lie, but finding none. Instead, in her eyes, he saw his own pain reflected back at him. "You should go," he finally said, his voice more tired than angry. Isabella nodded slightly. "As you wish. Just please say goodnight to the children. They long to see you." She walked out with the same calm composure she had shown at the start. Left alone, Alexander drained his glass of wine. He drank until the bottle stood empty, the fire of the liquor searing his throat. Yet no warmth reached his chest, only a storm that raged louder with every swallow. Staggering slightly, Alexander walked down the long corridor, each step echoing against the marble floor as though mocking his hesitation. The door to his children's room stood just a few feet away, painted in soft colors that once brought him comfort. He placed his hand on the knob, his pulse quickening, but his fingers froze. The thought of facing their innocent eyes pierced deeper than any grief. Unable to gather the courage, he turned away. The next morning, as sunlight barely spilled through the window, Alexander heard a soft knock at the door. He frowned, assuming it was a servant bringing documents from the firm. But when the door opened, two small figures appeared, carrying a trembling tray. "Papa," Daniel exclaimed, "Miss Isabella told us to bring you coffee." On the tray sat a steaming cup of black coffee. David held it carefully with both hands, as if carrying treasure. Daniel, with no regard for formality, rushed forward and wrapped his arms tightly around his father. "Good morning, Papa," he said, his eyes sparkling. Alexander froze. How long had it been since he'd heard such a simple, warm greeting? His hand trembled as he rested it on Daniel's shoulder, pulling both boys into his embrace. It lasted only a moment, yet his heart beat with a strange rhythm, as though some of the ice within him had begun to melt. That entire day, Alexander sat in his office, staring at blueprints, but unable to focus. Isabella's words from the night before, her steady, fearless gaze, and the morning's embrace from his sons. Each memory overlapped and echoed in his mind. When the clock struck 3, Alexander made his choice. He shut his laptop and rose from his chair. For the first time in years, he wasn't using work to avoid the emptiness. He wanted to go home, back to his boys, and to the woman who had dared to touch the deepest wound in his heart. That afternoon, the back garden was livelier than usual. Isabella spread a small mat across the grass, setting down clay pots, seed packets, and a watering can. Daniel and David, more accustomed to indoor play, were buzzing with excitement at the sight of the tools. "Miss, what flowers are these?" Daniel asked, holding up a packet of seeds. Isabella smiled softly. "These are forget-me-nots. People say they help us remember the most important things in our hearts." David's eyes lit up. "Like remembering Mama?" The air grew still. Daniel glanced at his brother, then nodded firmly. "Let's plant them for Mama." Isabella placed a hand gently on their shoulders. Her own heart stirred. "Yes, these flowers will be your gift to her." From the upstairs balcony, Alexander watched. His chest tightened at the sound of Elena's name. His first instinct was to stop it all, but his feet refused to move. He saw his sons laughing, their hands smeared with soil, and realized he hadn't seen them this happy in years. At last he descended into the garden. When the children spotted him, Daniel called out excitedly, "Papa, come help us dig." Alexander hesitated. He hadn't touched a spade since Elena's funeral, yet the eager look in their eyes left him no choice. He shed his jacket, rolled up his sleeves, and knelt beside them. "Hand me the little spade," he said, his voice steady, no longer icy. Daniel and David cheered, rushing to hand him the tool. Alexander pressed it into the earth, feeling the damp soil yield beneath him. The scent rose up, strange, grounding, almost peaceful. As father and sons worked together, Isabella watched from the side, her heart stirring. For the first time in years, Alexander was truly sharing a moment with his children. When the last seeds were buried, David looked up. "Papa, did Mama like these flowers?" Alexander froze. The question cut deep into the defenses he had guarded for so long. But this time, he didn't run. Meeting their eyes, his voice wavered slightly. "Yes, she planted them in the corner of the garden. She called them her memory flowers." The boys' faces lit with wonder. "Then she'll love these for sure," Daniel exclaimed. Alexander nodded, his throat tight. He had just done what he had avoided for 3 years, spoken of Elena in front of his children, and instead of unbearable pain, he felt a quiet relief, as though a burden had finally lifted. When the pots were neatly arranged, Isabella handed him the watering can. Alexander took it and poured over the soil. The evening light bathed the garden in gold. "Papa," Daniel whispered, "these flowers will bloom so Mama can see them from heaven, right?" Pulling both boys close, Alexander's voice grew low but warm. "Yes, and every time you see them, remember that Mama is always in our hearts." Isabella turned away, hiding the tears that welled in her eyes. She knew she had just witnessed a miracle, not one born of faith, but of love, slowly returning to life in this family. That night, after the twins had fallen asleep and the mansion lay wrapped in silence, Alexander stood before the mahogany door at the end of the east wing. It had been shut for 3 years, the door to Elena's room. His hand rested on the doorknob, trembling as though it concealed a storm he dared not face. He hesitated, then the faint click of the lock echoed. The door creaked open, and memories rushed in. Everything was just as she had left it. A white dress draped neatly over a chair. A novel lay face down on the nightstand. A hairbrush still held strands of her soft brown hair. On the vanity, a perfume bottle had faded with time, yet its familiar fragrance lingered faintly in the air. Alexander stepped inside, his legs heavy. He picked up a silver frame from the table. Elena cradling the newborn twins, her smile radiant despite exhaustion. As he stared at the picture, his chest tightened painfully. For 3 years he had locked this room, believing that hiding these keepsakes would banish the grief. But standing amid all these intact traces, he finally understood. He hadn't been protecting himself. He had been running from love. Tears slipped down uncontrollably. He sat on the edge of the bed, clutching the frame to his chest. "I'm sorry, Elena. I've done it all wrong. His voice cracked, breaking into the suffocating silence. In that stillness, he sensed a gentle presence behind him. Turning, he saw Isabella at the doorway. She didn't step inside, didn't speak. She only looked at him with eyes full of understanding. No words were needed. Her quiet presence was enough. Alexander lowered his head, letting the grief pour out. After a long while, when his breathing steadied, he lifted his gaze once more, letting his eyes roam the room. "I was wrong to think running away would make me forget, but love doesn't disappear. It only hides." Isabella gave a small nod, a wistful smile touching her lips. She knew he had just taken a crucial step, not denying anymore, but beginning to face it. And in that moment, the room that had seemed like a tomb of memories became the place where healing quietly began. He didn't sleep much that night. Yet, when dawn arrived, for the first time in 3 years, he woke not with dread, but with resolve. The next morning, there was something different in the air at the mansion. Alexander sat at the head of the table, in front of him a small wooden box he had brought from Elena's room. The twins stared at it with unhidden curiosity. "Papa, what's inside?" Daniel asked, his eyes wide. Alexander drew a deep breath. His hand rested on the lid, hesitated for a moment, then opened it. Inside lay a worn, dark blue leather album. He pulled it out and placed it carefully on the table. "These are your mother's memories." His voice was low, trembling slightly. Silence fell. David and Daniel seemed to hold their breath as Alexander turned the first page. A photograph of Elena on the beach, her hair caught in the wind, her smile radiant as sunlight. "This was our first trip together," Alexander said softly. "Your mother loved the ocean. She said the waves were like the heart, sometimes calm, sometimes wild, but always beautiful." The boys leaned closer, their eyes shining. "Mama was so beautiful," David whispered. Alexander smiled, rare and bittersweet. He turned more pages. Their wedding day, Elena cradling her pregnant belly, then holding the newborn twins in her arms. "She loved pistachio ice cream," he continued, his voice rough. "Even in winter she'd eat it, saying cold should be fought with cold." The boys giggled. "Can we have pistachio ice cream today, to remember Mama?" Daniel burst out. Tears pricked Alexander's eyes, but he nodded. "Yes, today we'll eat ice cream." At the far end of the table, Isabella sat silently, watching. She didn't interrupt, only observed with quiet reverence. She knew that every word Alexander spoke wasn't only for his children, it was also for himself. When the album neared its last page, Alexander paused. His eyes reddened, his voice breaking. "I'm sorry for hiding all this for 3 years. I thought silence would ease your pain, but instead I kept you from knowing a part of your mother." David squeezed his father's hand, whispering, "It's okay, Papa. Now you've told us. We'll remember forever." Daniel hugged him tightly, his head pressed against his chest. "I miss Mama, but I'm happy you showed us her pictures." Alexander held both boys close. In that embrace, he felt as though Elena was smiling somewhere, watching them gathered together. And for the first time in years, his grief no longer felt like a suffocating weight, but like a bridge, bringing father and sons closer than ever before. That afternoon, while rummaging through a long-forgotten storage corner, Alexander stumbled upon an old wooden case covered in dust. When he opened it, he froze. Inside lay the guitar that had accompanied him through his youth. He carefully lifted it out, his hand brushing over the worn wood. Memories rushed back, Elena by the window, listening as he strummed. Her gentle smile, her eyes glowing with pride. All of it vivid, alive in his mind. Alexander carried the guitar to the veranda. Resting it on his lap, he tried a few chords. The sound was rough, out of tune after years of silence, yet it struck a chord deep within him. Isabella stepped out, a cup of tea in her hand. Seeing his hesitant figure, she smiled softly. "You should keep playing. Music never really left you, Alexander." The twins burst out from inside, their eyes wide with excitement at the sight of the guitar. "Papa, you can play," Daniel shouted. "Play something for us," David added eagerly. Alexander hesitated for a moment, then nodded. His trembling fingers pressed the strings, and a slow melody began to emerge. The first notes stumbled, rough and broken. But with each chord, something awakened, not just in the guitar, but in him. It was as if the instrument had been waiting all these years to find his hands again. The boys clapped along, singing loudly with their pure, childlike voices. Daniel leaned on his brother's shoulder, both laughing, before pulling Isabella into their little circle. Without hesitation, she joined in, her soft voice weaving into the music. The house, silent for years, now came alive with music, laughter, and life. Alexander lifted his gaze, instinctively searching for Elena's presence. But instead of sorrow, a deep, quiet peace filled him. When the song ended, the twins jumped up. "Again, Papa, one more." Alexander laughed, a genuine laugh, one that had long been absent from his face. "All right, but only one more, then bedtime." Isabella sat nearby, quietly taking it all in. In the days that followed, life inside the mansion shifted so noticeably that everyone felt it. In the mornings, instead of rushing out while the twins were still half asleep, Alexander stayed to share breakfast. He sipped the coffee Daniel proudly brought him, listening as David chattered about his drawing assignment. Laughter mingled with the clinking of spoons against cereal bowls, a simple sound the house had not heard in years. One day, Alexander decided to drive his sons to school himself. From the back seat, the boys chirped excitedly about their upcoming play rehearsal. When the car stopped at the gate, Daniel leaned forward and kissed his father's cheek. "Have a good day, Papa." Alexander stood frozen for a moment after they disappeared into the building, his heart filled with a sweetness both foreign and familiar. That weekend, he attended their school event alongside Isabella. In the crowded auditorium, Alexander sat in the front row, his eyes fixed on the stage. When David, once so timid, spoke his lines with confidence, Alexander rose to his feet, clapping loudly. Daniel beamed, waving proudly at his father. Beside him, Isabella leaned closer and whispered, "They've changed so much." Alexander nodded, his gaze meeting the deep brown of her eyes. For a fleeting moment, silence stretched between them, meaningful and unspoken, before they both turned back to the stage, hearts beating just a little too fast. In the mansion, Isabella had quietly become the keeper of its warmth. She guided the boys in planting seeds in the garden, prepared simple family dinners, read stories at bedtime. But more than anything, she restored a sense of home Alexander thought he had lost forever. On many nights after the twins had gone to bed, Alexander and Isabella sat together in the living room. Sometimes he strummed a few chords on the guitar while she listened in silence. Sometimes their eyes met, holding for just a second too long to be accidental. That night, the mansion lay wrapped in gentle stillness. After dinner, while the twins had gone upstairs to prepare for bed, Alexander and Isabella lingered in the garden. Moonlight spilled over the blooming forget-me-nots, painting them silver blue in the quiet night. For a long moment, Alexander said nothing, his hands clasped tightly as if gathering courage. At last, his voice broke the silence, trembling slightly. "Isabella, I thought my heart would remain locked forever after losing Elena. But you stepped in and did what I never thought possible. You brought laughter back to my children, light back into this house. And for me, you've made me want to live again." Isabella froze. Her deep brown eyes glimmered with emotion, yet shadows of fear lingered there. "Alexander, I care for you too. But I'm afraid. I don't want to become Elena's shadow, and I don't want the boys to think I'm here to replace their mother." He stepped closer, his gaze steady. "No one can replace Elena. She will always be part of us, but that doesn't mean this heart cannot open again. I don't want you to be Elena. I want you to be Isabella, the woman who brought us hope." At that moment, a soft rustle came from the glass doors. The twins, still awake, peeked out shyly. Daniel asked in a small voice, "Papa, does this mean Miss Isabella will be our new mama?" Alexander knelt, beckoning them closer. Pulling them into his arms, he spoke gently. "Your mama can never be replaced. Elena will always be your mother, in my heart and in yours. But Isabella, if you agree, she will become part of our family in her own way." David looked at Daniel, then both boys nodded eagerly. "We want Miss Isabella to stay forever." Isabella pressed a hand to her mouth, tears spilling freely. She bent down, wrapping her arms around all three of them, her heart overflowing with joy. Alexander took her hand firmly. Under the soft moonlight, he reached into his pocket, drew out a small box, and opened it to reveal a simple silver ring. "Isabella, you've given me and the boys a new beginning. Will you stay with us, not to replace Elena, but to walk beside us, to build a family filled with love, for the rest of your life?" Her lips trembled, but her radiant smile lit the night. "Yes, I will." The twins cheered, dancing around them as if it were a festival. Above them, the full moon cast its glow over the garden of forget-me-nots, their blue petals shimmering like stars scattered across the earth. In that moment, Alexander lifted his gaze, and deep within, he knew Elena was smiling from afar. at peace, knowing her family had finally found their way back to the light.